Wonderful. Hi, thank you to everybody for joining us today. We're really excited to be talking about what's coming up in 2025 in identity verification. Today, we've got a fantastic lineup of folks to share some of the latest insights. So we are joined today by the wonderful Will Charnley, who is Chief Operating Officer at Liminal. Will comes to the table with extensive experience in cybersecurity, financial crime compliance, trust and safety, so really running the full gamut. And he's bringing these strategic insights into, the operational and technical challenges of fraud prevention. We're also joined today with Albert Roux from Microblink, leading product. Um, uh, Albert has more than 20 years of experience combating fraud and developing cutting-edge identity solutions. So really kind of keen to secure platforms and provide seamless digital ecosystems. And so these two folks today are going to walk us through what to expect and what are some of the kind of key trends on the horizon in document verification for 2025. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off. We'd love for this webinar to have a little bit of interactivity as well. And so you'll see that there's a Q&A function. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat throughout the webinar. We will have some time at the end of the webinar to go through those that Q&A. And then lastly, this webinar is going to be recorded, so you're welcome to watch it on demand after the time as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Will to kick us off. What is the lay of the land as we're wrapping up 2024?
Awesome. Thanks, Rex, for having me and for a great introduction. And super excited to be with the Microblink team and especially Albert, very esteemed colleague on this panel as well. So very excited to get going on some of the trends that we have. So we'll start today off just I think initially a little bit broader, which is what we're talking about today is really identity document verification and where the market is headed there. So I won't spend too much time on this slide. I know for many folks here, right, this is not going to be super surprising, hopefully, which is that we have been moving over the last 20 plus years from a physical first environment. So if you think about how you historically have interacted with businesses as a consumer, right? Going into bank branches, going into, at one point maybe a physical mall to go to stores, even grocery shopping at the actual store. We've been moving more and more towards a digital environment. Obviously, COVID accelerated that pretty rapidly. And we're to the point today where most consumers open and interact exclusively with at least 20 plus accounts every year in a digital way. And so what we're really going to be talking about is, as we see kind of on this slide, we are at this point where 83% of people have a preference for only interacting with businesses in a digital way. 82%, which is 4/5 of the population, are pretty familiar with identity verification as a process to create that account. That would be a database check. That would be a document verification. That would be a selfie to document match. So there's high familiarity with identity verification, the techniques. It's being used today. And so, all that leads us to this point, which we're really going to spend time talking about today, which is, so where is this market going? What are the changes? What are the innovations that are happening? And what makes us really excited, hopefully the last slide is very straightforward, but where we're seeing the market going is that there's a lot of change and a lot of opportunity in the identity verification market. In particular, while we've seen rising demand for verifying an individual's identity, what we're seeing is that buyers need better built solutions depending on their pain points, depending on their use cases to meet consumer demand when it comes to privacy, when it comes to security, when it comes to user experience. And so if we think about the history of identity verification, I'm just going to give you a little history lesson, then we'll speed right up to this. Many identity verification providers, actually we track about 3,500 companies and over 300 identity verification providers. 92% of those providers historically have focused in financial services. In doing that, most of those solutions have really focused on compliance-centered solutions, right? Identity is a part of what we would call Know Your Customer KYC. And so when you look at these 2025 trends, the big overarching theme here really is many are non-compliance focused. Where we're seeing this market go is that it needs to evolve outside of compliance to get better solutioning in many different ways. So first, and we'll dive into each of these more deeply, while Gen AI fraud has been a major pain point everywhere, one major area for concern we're seeing is account opening fraud, especially in what we would call synthetic identity creation, which we will get into here in a bit. Second big trend we'll dive into here, while identity verification has long been the gold standard, as we saw on the last slide for account opening, we are seeing more and more use cases, for example, account recovery transactions, especially when it comes to age-restricted goods, that really not only benefit, but really are going to start to require identity, and verifying identities as a key component to creating a good solution there, beyond kind of that day zero onboarding moment. And third, and this goes back to that compliance point, while buyers in other markets have long used some sort of identity verification solution, we are seeing more and more demand, both from the consumer saying, hey, I need something built for this experience, and from buyers alike, that they need tailored solutions to meet the specific use case and what we would call market use case. So use case plus vertical. So not KYC for banking, identity verification for vertical X. So we'll be diving into this, but before we start really going deep, Albert, I know you spent the last decade plus really building solutions and innovative solutions in the space. How have you seen demand evolve, product roadmaps evolve, shift over time to kind of get to this point? I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, Will, I think what we see generally across the industry and is a demand from customers to have more than just a point solution. I think the main aspect for customers, what they want to do is to be able to depend on one or two vendors that actually can cover their use cases. And point solution right now are reaching their limits, right? So for example, if you just have a vendor that provide only a document verification, you know that for you to be able to just to comply with regulatory requirements is to have also biometrics, database checks, device intelligence, behavioral biometrics. So how do you combine all those capabilities, but also leverage the data that they expose for you to essentially obtain, for example, a risk score? And that what we see is that now customers start to realize we want to have a platform which we can gain the insight of what's happening from the user onboarding stage, and also add additional metrics, for example, pass rate or drop-off rates that they're able to leverage via those platforms. So the rise of analytics are also becoming a reality for many of our customers, and they want this in a centralized platform, centralized point. So what I see generally is a shift now of looking beyond just a point solution, but looking for vendors who can actually cover end-to-end, not only the entire workflows, but also handle the new threats. And for the new threats in particular with synthetic identity fraud or Gen AI, you're going to need a combination of things. So how do you do that? You need to be able to drive this via an orchestration platform. If you don't have it yourself built in-house, which is the majority of our customers, you're going to look for someone who can provide that solution.
Totally, and I think that's you got my segue down. This is perfect. I think it's a perfect segue into this piece, which is our first big trend we're diving into is around fraud. Unfortunately for many of the folks on this call who are buying solutions to combat fraud, the reality is the market is getting harder and harder. It's more challenging to prevent fraud than ever right now. As you see in the slide, we are predicting that synthetic identity fraud is poised to more than triple by 2030. So losses are expected to go from about 30 billion today, or yesterday, I guess 36 today, to over 100 billion in losses. So things are clearly getting worse on that front. And as Albert has mentioned, I think you did a really good job here, which, why is this happening? The reality is generative AI has made um, committing fraud incredibly obtainable, easy, and the quality has gone way up. So we've had higher volumes of fraud, we've had more sophisticated fraud attacks, and it's more accessible to anyone. A good example here, there's a site called OnlyFakes, and for $10, you can make a synthetic document. That's it. You don't need any training. You don't need to be a computer scientist. You don't need any programming skills at all. You just need $10 and the ability to pay. Um, and the unfortunate part is this is, the sophistication is so good, it's actually changing the way folks are dealing with fraud. Was talking with a practitioner the other day, and they had to change their fraud models because, how they now are preventing fraud is they're taking some of the best documents that they're seeing and saying, hey, wait a minute, these ones are the actual fraudulent documents because they're too good. So, the quality is such that they actually better than the real thing. Um, some of the areas we call out here, right? AI-enabled fraud. Obviously, folks are preparing for it to be a huge, 88% to grow substantially over the next 2 years. And I think even more alarming on this slide is 92% of buyers do not have a solution they feel like they can rely on to prevent generative AI attacks, deep fakes, meaning that they know something's coming and they know they're not prepared for it. Albert, I always say you're kind of the leader in this space when it comes to strategies to prevent fraud. I know you started to talk about some of them, but what would you say to some of these, 92% of practitioners that are kind of unsure of where to start when they're preventing fraud?
I think the main area is to realize that they probably have more fraud than they think they have. I mean, when we talk to customers, they tend to think, especially when it came down to Gen AIs that are not exposed to it, but it's simply when we look and we review sample of documents that we verify, for example, we can recognize frauds that our clients don't even catch. And the main aspect is for them to first conduct an audit, if possible, with document experts or biometric experts to look at the extent of the attacks they are suffering from. I think that would be my first recommendation. The second step is, of course, looking for vendors that look at fighting the fraud on different aspects, right? And how do they combine different capabilities together? I think that's really important. For example, for Gen AI, people tend to think the main risk is the new ChatGPT who can generate synthetic identities, but in reality, it goes beyond just curbing a ChatGPT ability to generate fake data. You have to look also ways to detect new, what we call the risk of foundation models for machine learning that can generate video almost in real time. So filters, for example. So there is a need for the new products that you're using to detect fraud to look into the liveness of a document, for example. So computer vision models needs to be adapted to improve on detecting whether or not a document present to you is live and does a person hold a real document. I think that's one of them. That's true also for biometric as well. And add new combination of products that are been existing on the market. So device intelligence, how do I tie a fingerprint to the document and to the biometric? And now how do I validate that information and make sure they are binded together? So next time the customers comes back and we already vetted that is legitimate, I can reuse that information or just add the minimum amount of friction. So those are the kind of things that I think they need to think about and plan for, because if they don't now, they are probably already suffering a lot of fraud if they don't realize it. I think there's a statistic out there that 54% of current crypto marketplace are already being bypassed essentially by fraudsters just because they don't have the right element of to detect fraud, right? So I think the combination of those different tools are not being put together today in the market.
I think, I think that makes total sense, and I love the idea. I think you really need a layered approach here. It's not a one thing is solving everything. I think you need to really understand how to layer things in. But Rex, I think we have some poll results around this. I would love to maybe dive in there if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been asking folks, what percentage of fraud attacks on their platform are created using Gen AI. So thanks everybody who has participated there. So let's take a look at what we're seeing in terms of results. So I think unsurprisingly, based on this conversation, there's quite a small percentage of fraud today is Gen I of folks who responded, but really the majority here of folks don't know really what they're seeing
Yeah.
on their platform. Is that's sort of what you'd expect to see, Will and Albert?
Yeah, because
Yeah, I'd love Albert's opinion. The unknown piece, I think, is super, super interesting. Albert, what's your take there?
And the reality is that what I was saying earlier is what I was recommended, conduct an audit with document expert, just to start. If we are just zooming on document, and generally most clients don't have the expertise. I mean, how do you recognize? I mean, majority of the pictures that we capture on the net, the quality is not very high in reality, right? I mean, there's not that many pictures being captured in 4K, for example. And if you're not a document expert, how are you going to know whether or not that document, that driver license being presented is real? You saw in the news recently on that case where United Healthcare CEO was killed by someone that used actually a fake ID to register in an hotel. And in my eyes, I can recognize immediately the fake ID, but that fake ID was held into somebody's hand, and that person was not even recognized to that it was a fake driver license. The reality is the majority of people don't realize this is fraud because you need to have some level of expertise in document examination. That's the reality. So,
Yeah, totally. I think complicating it is, synthetic identity, the word's a little bit of a misnomer in that people think it means every part of it's fake. That's usually not the case, right? It's a combination of fake and actual real verified data, right? Oftentimes address can be right. It might be a right social, just not the right combination of social, DOB, name. And so, you might be verifying parts of this or getting a score that says, hey, this is passable, which really actually is a synthetic identity. Yeah, I think that's one of the more challenging pieces of it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I was just about to say, the result of the poll is telling something, right? It simply means we don't know the type of fraud that we are facing because we're unable to recognize what is fraud and what is actually a genuine user at this point.
100. Yeah, and I think the point you made, Albert, about like you need to get a baseline first. Like step one is you have to understand the extent of the problem. I mean, it's hard to deal with a problem if you don't know where you're vulnerable, what's happening, what the attack is looking like. And I think that's a really great point there. On that front, I think we've found, especially synthetic identity, to be a massive issue in studies with buyers. 89% think it's a significant to very significant issue as part of their business. And I think the really interesting part here, the 80% to us, is folks are actually planning to use a more bespoke or tailored solution, specialized solution for this. Albert, I know we have to move on here to the kind of next topic, but if you were to say, hey, these are the kind of one or two things you should look for in a specialized solution, what would your recommendation be to buyers in the room?
I mean, when it comes down to synthetic identity, I think you have to couple document verification plus at least a database check, because synthetic identity, the concept is very simple. You take different elements of real data, mix them together, and then you create a Frankenstein identity. So now something just simple as verifying somebody's address could be helpful because is that person really residing there? At least that could be an indicator. This social security number verification could be another way to do this, but even social security numbers are being manipulated with synthetic identities. So essentially, I think the most easiest way would be to have a simple database check. After that, of course, liveness, that's also an important key point to have in your element. But in short, as I mentioned, it's a combination of different elements that validates the information being presented to you via a document or via biometrics. And what they should be looking into a vendor is a vendor that is able to combine those different capabilities, but also enables them to measure the effectiveness of those defenses mechanism as well. So that will be something I will recommend to curb this for now.
Yeah, absolutely. Just moving us along because we have another two to get through here. So next big thing that we're calling out as a trend as we head into 2025 is the importance of identity beyond account opening. So first slide, that slide we all saw where everyone's familiar with identity verification and document verification and account opening. That has long been a process that people are familiar with. We're starting to see emerge is a need for these solutions beyond that day zero account opening event. What we are finding is because there are rising fraud threats, which we've covered to some extent, there's increased need for transaction security and authorization. If you've been following any of the things that have been going on with Zelle and the government and the need of ACH wire fraud, et cetera, as well as new use cases emerging like age assurance. Identity is really something that is needed more and more to tie whatever it is, the transaction, the token, if it's in login, back to the actual person who's doing something. Additionally, what we've seen is, as new modalities are starting to emerge in other parts of the customer journey, example here being something like passkeys, right? Identity can play a really crucial role in ensuring the security where other modalities like SMS OTP, like email OTP have not really done a good job and are becoming less secure for folks. Albert, I know you work with a lot of customers. What are some of the needs you're hearing from folks for, identity beyond kind of that initial account opening moment?
Yeah, beyond initial onboarding, I think a lot of customers are worried about account takeover. I think that's one of the main risks because of generative AI and synthetic identity, but primarily because of generative AI. Imagine now I can fake your biometrics, so your face, your voice, and your documents. That means that someone can now access your account relatively easily, right? So I think that's one of the biggest concerns our customers have is how do I protect myself against account takeover? The second concern, I think that I do foresee, I mean, beyond its authentication in general, as you mentioned, I think that's the biggest concern. But also with a new regulation coming into place, especially for social media access, age verification. So not only for social media, but restricted goods, for example. That is, how do I verify someone's age and how do I verify it relatively accurately, which is a challenge, right? So I think right now our customers are widely spread, at least for Microblink, beyond just banking and financial services. So that also concerns not only customers who are subject to regulatory compliance, but also other customers as well. They are worried about the same threat. But right now,
Yeah. Yeah.
no, go ahead. Sorry, Will.
I was going to say the age thing. I know we're going to get into it also in a little bit, but is I think that is I think even more kind of squarely regulation is really accelerating. Australia's social media law that came out. It might have been 2 weeks ago at this point. Time is all relative this close to the holiday. But I thought that was really telling, and we've heard from a lot of other folks in governments around the world that they are considering similar type regulations, which would obviously, I think, very vastly accelerate the need for age solutions for sure. I think we have, Rex, is it up or should I flip to it? A poll coming up here.
Yeah, I'll launch it right now. So we've got another poll for our audience. Love to hear from you all how relevant document verification is for your account recovery or to mitigate account takeover at your organizations. I'll give you all a second to respond. We've already got a couple of answers coming in. And I'll just take this moment to mention as well, we're seeing some great questions come in the Q&A. Feel free to keep adding your questions there. And as I said, we'll take some time at the end of the webinar to answer them.
And then while we're waiting for the poll as well, one thing I wanted to mention, we cite email and SMS OTP as traditional ways to authenticate users. I think what's important now is when you consider a vendor, an IDV vendor, is do they offer biometric verification? Do they offer multi-factor authentication beyond just SMS OTP? I think that is also important to consider.
100%. I think especially along the lines of biometric authentication, we did a very large customer authentication report. Number one area folks were looking for as from a buyer perspective as a way to secure their authentication was biometrics. Biggest challenge they found was account recovery. I think biometrics can play a key role in both of those areas for sure.
And then you have also device intelligence, essentially tying your personal device to an identity. I think that's really important for you to integrate if you're a merchant or a banking institution. Is how do I recognize I've seen that user before and make sure that their device and their profiles, the way they interact with your application, their device, can help you determine it is the same person. So those are the things that you should absolutely use in combination as well. So something just simple as a device intelligence product can tell you, is that person even in the same geography when they are trying to access your account? That is a very simple check you can do via an IP address check, and that should be enforced at the minimum in your workflows.
Let's go ahead and look at the results of the poll.
I love it. I love it. Albert, I don't know about you, but this is I think these are great results, and I think point to a lot of the folks here are actually kind of at the forefront. When we've done studies and what we're showing on this slide is, a year ago, not many folks were doing this, and we've seen massive acceleration of adoption, right? Going from 8% to 23% is huge. I mean, that's a big increase. And it still means this market's pretty nascent. So, Albert, I don't know if you feel differently, but I'm bad at math, 86% of folks who are doing this or plan to do it soon. I think that would be our recommendation, and now is the right time to act, I think. Albert, I don't know if you have different reaction to the poll, but that's my first glance there.
No, I think it's a known thing, right? Because now on top of this, IDs are getting digitized. So now you're going to have digital copies of your identity documents. So I mean that makes things even simpler for you to authenticate documents, which will be a thing. And so you definitely want to have this in your arsenal when you check someone's onboarding or accessing an account. And also with a database check, some of them are relatively robust. You can add this on top of your document verification without adding any friction, because you're talking about milliseconds essentially to do this. So not surprised by the trend, and I think that's a good sign.
Yeah, and I think in what we call it on the right side, it's not just ATO, it's not just account recovery, although those are two big areas, especially account recovery. And you mentioned SMS OTP, that is huge vulnerabilities. There's also the other side of the coin. My wife got locked out of her bank account and it was call center. And you had to go, the password reset was call center. And that is, also not the most secure, because there's plenty different ways to defraud that process. And also you talk about friction. I'm going into the branch is probably number one, and number two has to be call center. So, balancing kind of security with user experience, there's not many better ways to do that than really by verifying someone's identity digitally. Some of the other areas that we found a lot of demand for folks here, it's worthwhile to explore. Definitely ATO and authentication, especially when it comes to authentication, moving beyond just tying a token back to a token. Like, your Apple iPhone isn't necessarily verifying your identity when they're doing that initial biometrics. It's easy enough to replace the biometric modality there. It's actually securing with biometric authentication back to the identity. And then the last piece here, which I know we touched upon and we'll talk about even in the next piece, age is a big use case. And then lastly, we didn't show it here, but we are seeing a bigger need for identity in transactions as well, specifically high value transactions. There was the government actually is started to try to put a lot of regulations in place for folks like Zelle, for a lot of these peer-to-peer payments, for ACH wire transfers as well, because there's a massive challenge around social engineering, where folks are sending money and then have no way to reclaim that money, even though they're being defrauded. Historically, financial institutions have not been liable for those transactions, but there's a lot of movement and talk to have them and make them actually need to put processes in place. So I think we'll see a lot more use cases where this is becoming really, really important. And with that, we'll move us to our third trend, so we stay on time here, which is this last, our last trend is really around how and why solutions are shifting outside of financial institutions. So, without going back and giving the history lesson I gave earlier, identity verification, identity document verification has long been used in financial services. That's where many, many folks started when they created solutions. Identity verification has moved into adjacent verticals. I'm assuming many folks here have probably gone through either a flow where they have verified the identity on platforms like LinkedIn or for an online gambling site or et cetera, et cetera. Many times as these solutions have expanded into new verticals, practitioners have been, kind of tasked or forced, however you want to look at it, with using a compliance first solution, a solution that was made for banking with a different wrapper, and then said it's being used for a non-compliance use case, like identity verification on LinkedIn. Example here, I was talking to a very large marketplace around doing business verification, and they told me they needed a KYB solution. They do not need a KYB solution or know your business solution. They don't need to do ultimate beneficial ownership. They don't need to do many of those manual processes that cause verifying a business for banks to be weeks or a week or week-long process, a very expensive process. And that just doesn't fit outside of financial services. The result of a lot of these misfit kind of solutions of, hey, we're using a compliance solution for a non-compliance use case, unfortunately, is shown on this slide, which is a ton of pain points when it comes to the consumer. So these results actually come from a large consumer survey we did, explicitly looking at folks outside of those financial services verticals. Two big things I'll call out, and then Albert, I'd love, your opinion here as well, which is, first big one is 31%, using kind of these misfit solutions, right? 31% had significant data privacy concerns, many times because they were asked to provide a lot more data than they actually felt like they should have to be, which makes sense because they're providing data you would need to open a bank account, not data or documents that you would expect to use to open a marketplace account or a social media account, as an example. Second big thing is we bucketed some of these together, which is, too much friction, too much time. There's a lot of UX concerns. A lot of folks are abandoning account opening processes. It's actually about 57% of folks felt this was a huge issue, their number one issue, when opening an account outside of financial services. Again, because they're using solutions not really tailored for the use case themselves. Albert, I think, data privacy, big one here. It stands out as a big concern. What are you hearing kind of from the market on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now most customers are always worried about data privacy, especially with lawsuits that we've seen in the US in regards to biometrics lately. I think what's really important to our customers is collect only the data essential to perform the check, discard that data as quickly as you don't have a need to do it. And at the same time, we want to make sure we retain the same level of accuracy when we determine whether or not the person is a fraudster or genuine, essentially. And at the end of the day, is really trying to balance the level of data that you capture, or at least maintain a certain level of privacy for the end user, while of course still ensuring that your product is accurate when making that determination. But also what we see with a lot of customers, at least the type of customers that we have, including into regulated areas, is that they want a higher pass rate, right? Today, actually, unfortunately, I would say probably the pass rate for a lot of financial institutions, a basic account opening, even on e-commerce, you're looking at something between 50 to 60%. I know a lot of companies claiming a higher pass rate, but what I observe over the last few years, I've been looking at data, is the pass rate is not that great. And why is because the majority of fraud vendors are not optimizing towards UX, right? There's very few companies out there that literally dedicate their efforts to ensuring your SDK screens make sense, are easily usable. So for example, in or document verification at Microblink, we can do a document check in less than 3 seconds right now. What we've seen with other vendors is it takes up to 30 seconds. In some cases, I've seen up to 2-3 minutes to do that. And that's when users start to become discouraged because they are facing not an interface that they are familiar with, and they drop off. And so in reality, when you craft a product for identity verification, privacy, of course, needs to be by design first, but also usability of your product. And that's why we invest heavily into that area of design, is because it's really important for our customers to see the highest possible pass rate.
100% agree with that piece. Yeah. Pass rates, I think people, buyers are oftentimes very shocked, right? You go on a website and it's 99.9% or some unobtainable number. And then in practice, I think people see the reality, when customers and their specific customers are actually using a solution, results can be really different. All the more important to make sure you're choosing the right solution for the customers you're trying to work with and the use case. And so I think we're going to flash up a poll here too as we go through this, but what this all means, and we've been talking about this, is that you really need to, as a practitioner, make sure you are buying a solution that fits your specific needs. Why we're breaking this out is the way we at Liminal see use cases. We call them market use cases, market being a vertical or industry. And the reason is really laid out on this slide, because when you're in, even if you're solving account opening, depending on your industry, who is buying that solution, the persona, the actual requirements that you're looking for that solution to do, the KPCs, the key purchasing criteria that you care about, and some other considerations are going to be vastly different, right? And so if you are a chief compliance officer at a bank, you are going to be buying a very compliance centered solution. You typically know what you want, right? You want to do things like perform customer due diligence, submit regulatory reports. If you are the head of trust and safety at an Airbnb type company, you don't need to do those things. What you really need to do is make sure that you are enhancing user trust on your platform, because that will lead to more booked nights and better experiences. You need to be able to do other different things like potentially verify age or do more risk scoring, do more safety type screening from a trust and safety perspective. And how you want to buy solutions might be really different. And so if you are, kind of looking at, hey, I'm more on the right side of this slide, you should be asking your practitioner how they're helping you solve some of these use cases. In particular, for age, which I know we have up on the screen here, right? I think there are different ways to verify age, and finding the right size for your use case is incredibly important. Rex, I don't know if we have the results back or.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a look.
Interesting. Albert, not to put you on the spot, but what do you make? I know you've spent a lot of time in the age verification space.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with the result of the poll, right? I mean, the reality is like majority of solutions currently on the market for age verification will rely either on computer vision based systems, so analyzing somebody's face and trying to guess what age range they're into, and unfortunately that's widely inaccurate at this point of time, right? There's not that many good solutions out there. So we have to look at different alternatives to this. There's
Yeah.
obviously a database check. You can extract information from a driver license and then check that information, make sure that it's accurate against some database. For example, AMVA, you can obtain the age of a person, but that's not sufficient today, right? So for us, we're looking at what are other ways beyond just document and biometric, or systems that are based on computer vision. So one thing that can be simple is to, for the US, for example, you can establish somebody's having a credit card or a debit card. In the US, that means that you're over 18. So that could be simple, something simple as this. And then on top of this, extracting that information off the debit card to make sure that it's a valid debit card, but also the liveness of that document, right? So looking
Yep.
beyond those documents in terms of verification and biometric could be a way to quickly validate age verification cases potentially, right? So those
Yep.
are alternatives that we can look at on the market. There's also a solution, of course, that but primarily these days is going to be either a database check, a biometric check, or a document verification. The alternatives that we offer at Microblink is via our Blink card product. That is used by companies. I mean, for example, if you look at Google, that's how they verify that someone is over 18 by just asking the user to show their debit card.
Yeah.
So I think today's solutions are not sufficient. There needs to be further refinement in that aspect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well, to the point you're making, which is, in reality, especially when it comes to things like age, having, different types of solutions depending on the risk is really important, right? And I think the example you gave even with Blink Card's a really good one, which is also tailoring your solution to what folks are likely to have. So if you're making an e-commerce transaction, you should and likely will have your card with you. You might not have your identity document with you, and so being able to do things off that card is important. But also layering in technology for some of those pieces, which is, in no circumstances probably a still picture going to be acceptable, way to do that as well. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
And also trigger those check whenever you need it. You don't need to always trigger those check at onboarding. You can also trigger them, for example, in a credit card not present. So for banking institutions, they do require a biometric. But if you're an e-commerce platform, do you really need that biometric check? Unlikely, right? You're going
yeah,
to do probably some kind of document check or debit card check for high risk moment where a transaction seems to be abnormal. So that is how we work with our customers to tailor a little bit their workflows, because in reality, most customers try to take what is done on the KYC side of the house and just port them over to
yeah,
their platform. And that's not ideal because it needs to be a little bit different. So use cases are different, so it needs to be tailored.
yeah, 100%. All right, with that, I think we want to get to questions, so we'll wrap up this piece and get to the Q&A, which is, all right, based on all that, kind of what is the so what here? Should we actually kind of take away? So three big points here. Both off of the terrible icons that I pulled up. You'll just have to live with those icons. First one, as it relates to fraud, I think having a really important for practitioners here to have a really honest conversation, not just around, hey, what are you doing from a compliance or identity perspective, but what are you doing for specific types of fraud? More and more we are seeing not only, it's not just account opening fraud, it is specific vectors like synthetic identity are where people are getting hurt the most. And so understanding where your pain points are, I think Albert's suggestion, really a great one. You have to really start by understanding how big the problem is, where the problem is, and make sure that if you're using a solution provider today, they're the right ones to address that problem. I think Albert had a lot of great points, but asking, hey, what are you using to combat synthetic identity? How is that different from, what you're using on the compliance side of the house to do a KYC check? Second big piece here, as we get to beyond, those day zero onboarding. I don't have to tell this audience because you guys are great and already planning to or are using solutions beyond account opening identity. If there are ones that came up today and you thought, hey, I'm not sure how to use that, I think worthwhile to explore. Where identity can help more securely do things for you or enhance processes for you, especially because beyond onboarding, account recovery, ATO, those are two major areas we are seeing massive issues where identity can significantly help prevent fraud, make better experiences for your customers, help retain some of those customers. And lastly, again, if you're in financial services, you might not have to do this, but if you were saying, hey, I use a vendor because, I asked my friend who has implemented that solution at Wells Fargo, and I don't know if it's right for me, I think worthwhile to explore what is a use case I'm actually trying to solve? What are the things that are most important to me? And making sure your vendor is helping you do those things. If it's around age, it doesn't have to be a KYC check every time, right? Understanding how are they approaching that solution? How are they thinking about it in more of a risk-based way? And with that, Rex, I think we're going to go to questions.
Yeah, as promised. Thank you all for your participation in the polls, as well as the great questions that you've been sending through. We might not have a chance to answer all of them in the 10 minutes that we have left today, but we will also be able to follow up with y'all offline. So again, feel free to drop any other remaining questions you have in the Q&A. But I'll kick us off with the first one here. What are the differences between an identity solution that is suitable for an SMB versus a large enterprise?
I can start us off, and then Albert, I'd love your perspective. So I'll just use financial services to start, and we've done a lot of studies with buyers of different sizes in that space. And so if you go talk to a tier one bank, and I'll use an example here, this is a specific example, but like a Citibank or a JP Morgan that has many multinational branches, they are more likely to have their own inner orchestration capabilities, existing vendor contracts. And so they're typically going to be in setting up things by specific solution type. And in some instances, right, if you are having big presence in the US and a big presence in Europe, you might want to use different vendors based on regional expertise for those areas. So as an example, right, you might want a vendor who really has deep expertise in the United States, especially direct connected data sources so that you can ensure data quality, ensure accuracy. And then you might want someone, in Europe or UK, right, who has those same level of expertise. That's pretty common. We see that for large enterprise buyers because the teams at those organizations are also very large. I mean, it's not uncommon that just from the cost for the team at those organizations, we're talking about millions of dollars that they're spending to have experts there. And so you have the actual team who can implement 10, 20 vendors and integrate them all together and try to orchestrate them. That's great for maybe the top 20, maybe the top 30 banks. Once you move beyond that, the team size shrinks pretty dramatically. Inner capabilities are typically not exactly the same. And so we see more and more that folks in those areas have a much greater need for solutions that can do two things. One is, help with multiple use cases, especially in account opening, but also help beyond account opening. And so that's where we see a much larger demand for platforms and for solutions that will work alongside those companies to help in other areas of the business. I know I just rambled on. Albert, I'm sure you have stuff to add there as well, but.
Well, this was perfect actually, because what we see with SMBs, they tend to have maybe 1, 2, 3 use cases at most. And then their workflow tends to be a little bit less complex, right? Because, for example, they don't have a human in the loop. So just when you conduct a basic verification of an ID, more large enterprises, usually they want to re-verify that the system performs adequately. So they will escalate a portion of the checks to a human. So that's not something an SMB can do. Also, what Will just mentioned is when you deal with your large enterprises, generally they are global, they're looking for a global solution, and they want to have also the ability to orchestrate workflows depending on the geo. So that means that a feature just as simple of parent-child accounts is really key for a large enterprise, but is not that important for an SMB because generally they don't have a branch in India or Vietnam or something like this. So, and also the complexity of the checks, right? So large enterprise, especially the one in regulated areas, their workflows are extremely complex and they demand a lot of different inputs in terms of signals, and then also the ability to centralize all the signals that they have and come down to a unique decision. So they are going to require biometrics, they are going to require document verification, device intelligence, all those different things. Whereas an SMB might have simpler use case and therefore the workflows are not as complex. So also the analytics part, even though both SMB and enterprises love to look at analytics, the reality is that to the level of granularity of data that they can use is very different between large enterprises and SMB, right? So sophistication of which they use data is totally different. So essentially a platform needs to enable both because we have some SMBs that are growing extremely fast and they can become a large enterprises within a year or two. How does a vendor adapt to the needs of their customers? You need to design a platform that can scale up. And essentially, that's what you need to look for even as an SMB is, can you find a fraud vendor on IDV platform can grow with you for the next 2, 3, 5 years, right? So when we build our products, we have this in mind. We want to be able to grow for our customers, and that's how we design our identity platform.
Yeah, fantastic question. The next question we have is kind of a two-parter, and it's really dealing with some of the pain points in the buying process when folks are looking to implement an identity solution. So here's the question. What are the aspects of identity verification, which is document and biometrics, which cause the most amount of friction during the buying phase? And then the second part of that is, what is the best way to navigate that? Because many identity providers would prefer to have their own SDK deployed to improve capture, but that can then be, a higher engineering cost for the business buyers, and then the stretched deployment times. I'd love to turn that over to you, Albert, as a builder. What's your take there?
I mean, the reality is what takes the most friction. And I think the question here is in terms of, I think, is the integration. I mean, that's always, whether it's an SMB or large enterprises, and to give you an idea of how long that takes for certain customers to integrate an SDK can be anywhere from 3 months to even 9 months. I've seen even 12 months, just because sometimes they don't have the teams who have the understanding of the technicalities to integrate another SDK to their application, especially mobile applications. Even though we try to strive to make our integration as seamless and easy as possible, so we can deploy on device, on premise, and on the cloud today at Microblink. But I've seen that even if we simplify the integration, sometimes they don't have the team expertise, and it seems sometimes it could be as simple as implementing one line of code change, but sometimes they simply don't have the person to even vet once the integration is done. So I think the main friction point is really the integration. So SDK, I see the comment here is that always take a lot of time. It is the optimal solution, right? If you want to have the best possible product performance, an SDK is the best way to go. Now, we have customers who prefer web views, for example, but web views are notoriously unreliable from the technical point of view. So the friction time of integration is less, but downstream that cause a lot of problems of compatibility between different devices and OSs. So the reality to answer that question is it's integration, regardless of whether it's document verification, biometric, or any other solution. The one that has the least amount of friction will be an API integration type, but even that can also bring some challenges.
Yeah. I would, from more of a market perspective, I think there are just two quick things to consider. One is, ensuring that the solution you're using, maybe I'll do three, is, when they say automated is really important, right? There are a lot of solutions in market that rely still heavily on manual review processes, which that's a big cause of friction of queuing users, right? And from a biometric perspective, I think it's also really important to understand, as you're talking to vendors, their expertise with different population types, both like, as an example, this same with document, that they have experienced scanning documents and scanning faces with different device types, right? In the US, predominantly it's iPhones. That's not the case in most places. And also different types of people, right? There are models with things like racial bias, et cetera, which can cause a lot of friction when it comes to onboarding certain types of users. So, important to understand the person you're using for document and biometrics, that they have, especially if you're looking globally, expertise within those regions, because, with a controlled data set, everything looks like it has no friction. But in practicality, it really depends on the customer base you're working with.
Yeah, and also to add is it's much easier to integrate a cloud-based solutions than it is to integrate on-prem. So generally, we try to recommend our customers to go for a cloud solution. Yes, there'll be a small component that relies on an SDK because you still need to capture an image for document verification, for example. But the easiest way is really to integrate with a cloud solution because the updates are coming much faster once you deploy. So for example, every time we onboard a new document, then you don't need to update your application. We support it on a cloud and you have access to the latest and greatest models and document coverage. So I think that could help some customers to make a decision is look for companies who can offer both a cloud solution and on device or on premise. But I will generally try to guide the customers to adopt our cloud solution because of the ease of integration and the scalability globally as well.
Great. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. This has been a really, really juicy session. Thank you to everybody who has participated. The questions have been great. For anything that wasn't answered on the call, we will make sure we follow up after the fact. And this webinar will also be available for you to watch again at your own leisure. So check out your email inboxes shortly. Albert, Will, thank you so much for all your insights and for your time today. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate you having me. This is great.
Thank you, everyone. Bye now.